Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. Today's story is about an artist whose voice somehow holds all those possibilities. But her real magic isn't just in her iconic songs. It's in the extraordinary, quietly determined life that shaped her art. Let's spend a little time together diving into the captivating world of Crystal Gayle, a gentle soul with floor-length hair, a voice that soared across genres, and a story that mirrors America's own hopes and hardships in the second half of the 20th century. Crystal Gayle's life is full of these quietly dramatic moments. Like many country music stories, hers begins in a small mining community shaped by struggles and resilience, overshadowed by the bigger personalities of a famous family member, only for her own star to shine its own unique light. She was that youngest sibling who witnessed tragedy, discovered music's healing power early on, and navigated her own identity within a family that sometimes felt larger than life. Maybe you know the broad strokes already, but let's unearth some of those little-known details, the soulful glimmers that give us deeper insight into who she is. Because if there's one thing that can make a legendary singer's story even more touching, it's the recognition that we all wrestle with family expectations, personal identity, and the weight of our own dreams. In a way, her story might resonate with every dreamer who's felt overshadowed by older siblings, by famous connections, or even by their own self-doubt. It was into this environment that Brenda Gayle Webb, whom the world would later know as Crystal Gayle, was born on January 9, 1951, in Paintsville, Kentucky. This was the tail end of the baby boom years, a time when small rural communities were still bound by the cyclical nature of the coal industry. Her father, Melvin Theodore Ted Webb, worked in the coal mines, dangerous, grueling work that came with the all-too-common threat of black lung disease. Her mother, Clara Marie Ramey Webb, did her best to keep the family afloat, raising 8 children through periods of uncertainty. It was a tough environment even for the hardest workers. Income was erratic, the environment was dusty and harsh, and every paycheck was precious. But folks who lived there recall an unbreakable sense of community and a fierce loyalty that bound families together. In those small towns where money was sparse but dreams abounded, music was more than just a pastime. It was a means to tell stories, build connection, and find hope. Because Brenda was the youngest, she saw her siblings come and go, forging their own paths or stepping in to help keep the household running. When she was just a toddler, her family relocated to Wabash, Indiana, hoping for better work opportunities and healthier living conditions. This was still a modest environment, but worlds away from the hollows of Kentucky in that it offered new possibilities, new faces, and new rhythms of life. By the time Brenda was starting school, she was exposed to a broader range of American culture, while never losing the sense of her family's Appalachian heritage. For her older siblings, that heritage included a deep connection to country music. And you can guess that one sibling in particular would become not just a big sister, but a guiding star of sorts, Loretta Lynn, who was already beginning to find her voice in the country music world. But here's a little twist. While Loretta Lynn would become a symbol of authentic, straight-from-the-holler country, Brenda would eventually walk a more contemporary path, weaving pop sensibilities into her music, without ever losing her down-home roots. That path, however, was anything but straightforward. There's a tendency to think that if you're related to someone famous, you'll have an easy ride. But for Brenda, forging her own identity would be the real challenge. And it all started with the person she was, quiet, introspective, a little uncertain, yet brimming with untapped resolve. In the 1960s, as Brenda moved into her teenage years, America was in a state of cultural upheaval. The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, The British invasion in music, these influences were swirling around her. Meanwhile, at home, everyday life was shaped by church gatherings, family chores, and that ever-present radio. She listened to pop hits and old-school country, gleaning from both a sense of emotional openness and melodic flair. Around the same time, her sister Loretta was scoring her early hits in Nashville, forging an unstoppable career that would soon crown her the coal miner's daughter. Loretta's success undoubtedly gave the Webb family hope, but it also introduced the specter of competition. How could the youngest ever measure up to the star of the family? When Brenda was still a teenager, Loretta encouraged her to start performing and nurtured that blossoming talent. But the brand of country that Brenda discovered resonated with her ear in a slightly different register. She loved the old country style, no doubt. However, there was a part of her that was drawn to the pop-infused side of the 60s and early 70s. She felt at home with those airy, melodic tunes that could cross over from the country charts to the pop charts. With Loretta's guidance, she found a door opening to bigger things. She visited Nashville, tested the waters with demos, and soon realized music was more than just a hobby. By the early 1970s, she signed her first recording contract, but there was one key detail that needed changing: her name. Brenda Gayle Webb was easy to misread, or sometimes conflated with other artists. And who wants confusion in a brand new career? According to family lore, Loretta suggested that Brenda adopt the name Crystal. Some say it was inspired by a road sign advertising a hamburger chain, or simply evoked the sparkling clarity of her voice. Either way, Crystal stuck, and soon she coupled it with her middle name Gayle, thus becoming Crystal Gayle. Many fans imagine that she'd always borne that magical moniker. But behind the scenes, this was just one more example of how forging her own identity required letting go of an old one. In 1974, Crystal released her debut album, Crystal Gayle. It performed decently on the charts, but it didn't exactly catapult her to stardom. She was still overshadowed by her sister's enormous presence in country music. Critics tended to compare them, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. Loretta was the gritty, feisty one, singing about birth control pills, marital troubles, and the raw edges of womanhood in a very direct way. Crystal, on the other hand, came across as softer spoken and more demure, with a gentle twang that leaned more to the mainstream. Even in promotional photos, you'd see a sweet-faced young woman who looked shy next to Loretta's confident gaze. But behind that softness lay a burning desire to chart her own course. Crystal was in love with more modern, contemporary sounds. She wanted to fuse them with country storytelling. It would take a little time for that perfect combination to arise, but when it did, it would define her. Let's talk about a turning point that arrived in 1976, when Crystal was working with producer Alan Reynolds. He sensed something unique in her voice, warm, with a luminous vibrato that could handle both country ballads and pop-leaning tunes. So they decided to record an album that wasn't afraid to explore cross-genre appeal. The project was titled Crystal, and it spawned a couple of hits, but the real game changer came in 1977 with We Must Believe in Magic, featuring the iconic single, Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue. That song was an instant phenomenon. It soared to the top of the country charts, then hopped onto the pop charts, capturing the imagination of listeners across the U.S. and eventually overseas as well. For Crystal Gayle, it was like stepping out of the shadows for the first time, her own star igniting with a distinct brilliance. Now nearly everyone recognizes that song today, but not as many people realize the ripple effect it had. Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue introduced a new wave of crossover country songs in an era dominated by disco on one hand and classic rock on the other. It cleared a space for more delicate, introspective country pop ballads, bridging the gap between mainstream radio and country stations in a big way. And from a personal standpoint, it gave Crystal a massive platform to stand on, distinct from Loretta's. In fact, We Must Believe in Magic was the first album by a female country artist to go platinum, marking a watershed moment for the industry itself. It signaled to record labels that female vocalists in country music weren't just supporting acts or niche performers. They could be cross-genre powerhouses. But let's pause for a second and think about what Crystal herself might have been going through. She jumped from relative anonymity to major stardom in a matter of months. It can be disorienting to have the world suddenly hang on your every note, especially when you were once the timid youngest sibling. Longtime acquaintances from Wabash have recalled that even as she achieved success, Crystal remained modest, almost startled by the fuss around her. She would come home to Indiana, spend time with family, and retreat from the limelight whenever she could. Fans often asked her how it felt to live under Loretta's shadow, but by the late 70s, the conversation began to shift. Crystal wasn't just Loretta Lynn's little sister anymore. She was a star in her own right. In a way, her stage presence reflected that duality. If you watch old performances, you'll see a soft, graceful figure, often dressed in flowing gowns, with hair cascading like a waterfall, singing with a gentle sincerity. She didn't adopt the flamboyant showmanship of some country performers, nor did she belt out tunes with a brash intensity. Instead, there was a quiet confidence that drew you in, as though she were singing directly to your heart. It's that same gentleness that would later allow her voice to shine in diverse settings, from primetime TV specials to the stage at the Grand Ole Opry. One of the less discussed aspects of her career is just how methodical she was in building a repertoire that showcased versatility. Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, she recorded songs that ranged from classic country ballads to jazzy standards. She wasn't content to just coast on one or two big hits. She put in the effort to remain relevant, working closely with skilled session musicians and producers who understood the nuance of her voice. Singles like Talking in Your Sleep, When I Dream, and Half the Way further cemented her place in the crossover canon. Each new release seemed to say, "This is who I am," someone with deep country roots, unafraid of drifting into new musical terrain. At this time, Nashville was buzzing with new opportunities. Country was broadening its audience, and artists like Kenny Rogers, Dolly Parton, and Barbara Mandrell were all finding ways to mix pop and adult contemporary flavors into their country foundations. There were critics who lamented the popification of country music, arguing that it lost some of its traditional edge. But for Crystal, it wasn't a cynical attempt to sell more records. It was simply the music she loved to sing. She admired the storytelling tradition of country, but she also adored the melodic playfulness and romance of contemporary pop. And for her, bridging those worlds felt natural, even essential. Of course, stepping out of purely traditional country also came with backlash. More traditional fans questioned her authenticity, wondering if she was drifting too far from her Appalachian lineage. Some radio stations even hesitated to play her if they felt the track was too pop. But for every traditionalist who fretted over her contemporary shift, there were new fans discovering a voice they found enchanting. It was a balancing act, one that required a thick skin, something Crystal, by her own admission, had to cultivate over time. Growing up as the youngest daughter of a large, close-knit but struggling family gave her that resilience. She'd already seen challenges that dwarfed a bit of criticism from the music press. Her personal life during these peak years remained relatively stable. She married her high school sweetheart, Bill Gatzimos, in 1971, a union that gave her an emotional anchor. Compared to many country music stars, whose personal lives became front-page drama, Crystal maintained a comparatively serene home life. She and Bill had 2 children, and she often spoke of how motherhood brought a sense of perspective to her high-profile career. While she was traveling or recording, she still tried to carve out time for normalcy, enjoying a quiet dinner at home, helping with homework, or simply catching up with relatives. If there was a controversy in her personal life, it was that there wasn't any. In a genre where heartbreak and scandal sometimes fueled the tabloids, Crystal's steady presence was refreshing. But that's not to say everything was forever rosy. Behind the scenes, she grappled with the typical industry pressures, demands for constant touring, the need to churn out new hits, and the feeling that if she paused for too long, the fickle public might move on. Maintaining her signature hair became a near-legendary commitment in itself. She rarely cut it, and it reached near floor length. Some people trivialized her as the lady with the hair, ignoring the artistry of her music. This superficial branding irked her, but she recognized the practical benefits too. Visual trademarks can help an artist stand out in a crowded market. Still, it must have been wearying at times. As fans would ask about her hair care secrets, perhaps what she really wanted to talk about was her creative evolution or the personal stories behind her songs. During this era, there's a poignant but little discussed memory that underscores how personally invested she was in her music. Around 1982, while recording what would become the album True Love, she was dealing with exhaustion from a demanding tour schedule, multiple media appearances, and the daily responsibilities of family life. One evening, she reportedly broke down in tears during a studio session because she couldn't quite capture the nuanced vocal run her producer was asking for. She felt stuck, trapped by her own perfectionism and the weight of expectations. The producer finally told her to take the evening off, go home, and rest. It was a small, tender moment that never made the headlines, but it reveals the pressure she placed on herself to do her absolute best. The next day, she returned with renewed energy and nailed the performance in just a couple of takes. That kind of dedication can take its toll, though. It's a delicate dance to remain gentle and warm in public while wrestling with inner anxieties. Her star power continued into the mid-1980s with further crossover hits, collaborations, and even a duet with Eddie Rabbitt called You and I. That single climbed the charts and became a staple at weddings, an ironic twist for an artist known for heartbreak-laden ballads. The 80s also saw her guest host television specials, appear on variety shows, and even dabble in acting cameos. There's a lesser-known cameo from around that time where she appeared in a sketch that spoofed her hair's length, lightly teasing herself with comedic self-awareness. This comedic side seldom made it to her music, but behind the scenes, she had a playful wit that people around her adored. Meanwhile, country music was evolving yet again, moving into the urban cowboy phase, and later toward the neon-soaked honky-tonk style. By the late 80s, artists like Randy Travis, Reba McEntire, and George Strait were ushering in a new wave of neo-traditionalism. Crystal found herself somewhat between eras. She wasn't strictly neo-traditional, but she also wasn't riding the adult contemporary wave as strongly anymore. Around this time, she decided to take a step back from churning out mainstream hits, focusing on smaller, more personal projects. She recorded gospel albums, dipped into Christmas music, and tackled tributes. One interesting diversion was a tribute album to Hoagy Carmichael, paying homage to the classic American songbook. These albums didn't garner the same chart success as her earlier hits, but they revealed her broad musical tastes and respect for timeless songwriting. This transition allowed her to do something that many older artists yearned to do: reconnect with her roots. She wasn't worried about dominating the charts anymore. Instead, she wanted to create music that felt meaningful, perhaps more intimate. As she moved into the 90s, a new generation of country fans was rising, with Garth Brooks, Shania Twain, and Faith Hill capturing the mainstream spotlight. Yet, loyal fans continued to show up for Crystal Gayle. She toured smaller venues, performed at festivals, and often sang beloved standards from her catalog, delighting fans who had followed her since the 70s. She was no longer at the center of a commercial whirlwind. She was something more enduring, like an old friend whose voice remained a comforting constant in an ever-changing world. One emotional story from her touring days in the early 90s involves a fan who approached her backstage, clutching an old vinyl copy of "We Must Believe in Magic." The woman explained that she'd grown up listening to the album with her mother, who had recently passed away. "Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue" was her mother's favorite song. In tears, the fan thanked Crystal for creating memories that she and her mother could share year after year. According to eyewitnesses, Crystal embraced the fan for a long moment, tears in her own eyes, deeply moved by how her music had become woven into someone's life story. She signed the vinyl in quiet reverence, as though aware of the weight that the autograph carried. This encounter underscores something essential. Behind every famous single lies 1,000 personal stories of listeners who found solace, joy, or a bittersweet memory in that song. Looking at controversies, we have to be honest. Crystal Gayle's story lacks the kind of public uproar or flamboyant scandal that often follows big stars. She didn't battle a high-profile substance abuse issue. She wasn't embroiled in messy divorces, and she didn't engage in public feuds. If there was controversy, it revolved around her musical style. Traditionalists sometimes criticized her for being too pop, while certain pop critics dismissed her as just another country singer. She also occasionally sparked debate among fans, who pitted her crossover success against her sister Loretta Lynn's more traditional approach. But these debates are more about industry definitions of authenticity than any personal wrongdoing. If anything, they illuminate the complexities of a changing genre. Crystal was an agent of change, expanding country's boundaries, proving that the public was hungry for a gentler, more polished sound that could still carry emotional weight. As for deeper historical debates, some music historians argue about whether her success paved the way for the wave of 80s and 90s country pop crossovers, or if it was merely part of a broader trend. Others point out that Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers were already bridging that gap, so perhaps Crystal was just riding the wave. But many fans and critics maintain that "Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue" was a seminal moment, arguably the single that truly showcased a country ballad's pop crossover potential on a global scale, especially for a female artist who was not already an established pop icon. That single alone didn't just top the country charts, it soared internationally, and it remains one of the signature songs that people recall when they think about the golden era of crossover country in the late 70s. In terms of historical significance, Crystal Gayle occupies a fascinating place in country music's evolution. She was among the first female artists to convincingly demonstrate that a gentle vocal approach, what some might call easy listening country, could be just as compelling and commercially potent as more robust, twang-laden styles. She solidified the notion that country wasn't a monolith, that it could absorb pop influences without losing its narrative soul. Her success encouraged later artists to step outside the strict boundaries of the genre, be it with modern production techniques, more universal lyrical themes, or simply a different vocal style. But even beyond the music industry impact, there's a human lesson we can take from her journey. In a family overshadowed by the unstoppable force that was Loretta Lynn, Crystal Gayle carved out her own musical identity and brought something entirely new to the table. She did it quietly, with her own brand of grace, never turning her back on her Appalachian roots, but also never letting them confine her. She followed her instincts, sang the songs that resonated with her heart, and refused to be categorized in a way that stifled her creativity. And in doing so, she expanded the boundaries of what it meant to be a country singer in the latter half of the 20th century. One rarely mentioned anecdote captures how she continued to remain relevant, even into the 2000s and 2010s. Some years ago, she was invited to a private industry gathering in Nashville, where a group of young singer-songwriters was performing. Without any fanfare, Crystal slipped into the audience. Partway through the event, she was invited to the stage, and she graciously performed an acoustic rendition of "Ready for the Times to Get Better," one of her less flashy but profoundly emotional tracks. The room reportedly fell silent, transfixed by that voice which still carried the softness, the subtlety, and the timeless warmth that had made her famous decades prior. When she finished, the young musicians stood in awe, many of them admitting later that they felt they were witnessing a piece of history. Even though the mainstream spotlight had moved on to younger stars, Crystal Gayle's presence still commanded reverence. Her influence remains a reminder that talent doesn't always shout. Sometimes it gently calls out, beckoning us to listen more deeply. If you ever get the chance to see a vintage recording of her in concert, pay attention to her facial expressions. She's not doing elaborate stage moves or belting with flashy vocal runs. Instead, she sings in a controlled, heartfelt manner, often gazing outward, as if she's imagining the face of the person whose story she's telling. This ability to convey genuine empathy through music is arguably the cornerstone of her legacy. Reflecting on her life now as she's entered her 70s, you see a woman who found contentment in her family, her faith, and her musical heritage. She's performed duets with younger artists, participated in tributes, and occasionally pops up at award ceremonies or special events, always received with warmth and respect. In 2017, she was inducted as a member of the Grand Ole Opry, a milestone that many felt was long overdue. That induction signified a formal recognition by the country music establishment of how integral she is to the tapestry of American music. So where does that leave us emotionally? As we reach the end of this journey, we see a life shaped by Appalachian roots, carried along by big dreams and polished by a gentle spirit that never left the ground entirely, even when fame beckoned. Her story reveals that sometimes the softest voices can carry the most profound messages, that authenticity has many faces, and that charting your own path can be an act of quiet courage. Her hair, famously long, became a symbol of her brand, but it also stands for perseverance, the patience to let something grow over time without cutting it short for quick convenience. That might be a metaphor for her career as well. Nurtured year after year, it blossomed into something gracefully iconic. For those of us who enjoy historical biographies, it's a tale of American transformation too. She journeyed from a dusty Kentucky mining town to shining stages around the globe, bridging old-school country storytelling with the breezy appeal of pop. She navigated the era of women's changing roles, witnessed the shifts in the music industry from vinyl to digital, and managed to keep her soul intact in a world that sometimes rewards brashness over subtlety. And in doing so, she reminds us that success doesn't have to be loud or scandalous. It can be a steady, thoughtful presence, building its audience one heartfelt note at a time. As we close, think back to that moment when you first heard her voice, maybe as a child riding in the back seat of a station wagon, or at home while flipping through radio stations, or perhaps more recently stumbling upon an oldie station that instantly transported you. There's a tenderness in her tone that might make you recall a certain memory of your own, a distant summer day, a heartbreak you once endured, or the comforting sense that you're not alone in the challenges you face. That is the hallmark of a true artist, leaving an emotional imprint that lasts far beyond any single chart position or award ceremony. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.